So what's going on here in this story? You've got this group of folks following Jesus. They start talking. They're separated from Jesus, some distance from Jesus. Jesus doesn't really overhear what they're saying. They're arguing about who is the greatest, right? There's this discussion about welcoming the least child. They tattle on other leaders with whom they disagree. They're reprimanded for creating more division amongst themselves. This is a story that sounds all too familiar these days, doesn't it? In a world of alternative facts, where the line between opinion and truth seems hopelessly blurred over, the disciples are unwilling to admit their lack of understanding, and that is striking. Maybe not so striking in this day that we live in. But they did not understand what Jesus was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. This fear to ask, to seek out, not only prevents the disciples from seizing the opportunity to benefit from the wisdom of their teacher and their leader, Jesus, it leads them to outright discord. Instead of learning and growing, their inability to ask and question leads them to engage in an unproductive argument about who is greater than the other. And when Jesus finally asks them what they're arguing about, they fall silent for the second time in the last chapter and a half. Which may lead some of us to reflect, what question am I afraid to ask Jesus this morning? The social media culture that we live in that quantifies the greatest in units of likes, right? Dislikes, share with, suggests that at some point we all have something we fear to ask. But they did not understand what Jesus was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Nobel laureate Isidore Rabi, whose work lay behind the invention of both magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, and the microwave oven, who would have guessed, was once asked why he became a scientist, and he replied, "My mother made me a scientist without ever intending it." Every other Jewish mother in Brooklyn would ask her child after school, "So, did you learn anything new today?" But not my mother. She always asked me a different question. "Izzy," she would say, "did you ask a good question today?" That difference, asking good questions, made me become a scientist. And I would say more accurately, a great scientist. Unfortunately, in some expressions of the Christian faith over the past, less than 100 years, but there's been this movement to shut down the questions. It's anti-intellectual strain of Christianity. It's bent on holding back questions. Whether about God or Jesus or the Bible or how faith relates to life or science, as if by ignoring the questions that people are asking, whether those people are followers or not, you somehow are doing a greater service to truth. Now, I'm glad to say that that's not the case with the Presbyterian side of the Christian family, and it is one of the reasons that I am committed to it. We Presbyterians have always said that one of our duties, responsibilities as followers of Jesus has been to love the Lord our God with all our heart, all our soul, all our strength, but also with all of our minds. And you cannot exactly exercise the mind without asking all those pesky questions that pester and pick on us all. And there are many good questions to pursue, aren't there? I mean, the classic, why is there so much evil in the world if God is so good and powerful? Or, to put it another way, why does a good and powerful God, who could stop evil at any moment, allow it to bring such pain and suffering to so many? This is an important question to ask yourself if you're going to say you're a person of faith. Or, seen from a different angle, if there is no God, if at the bottom of things there's only chance, there's only randomness, why do we even feel as if there is such a thing as good and evil? Or justice and injustice? Where does this sense of right or wrong, good and evil even come from? There are a lot of good questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? How is it that we are here at all? And why do we human beings all seem to have this profound restlessness within? Why do we have a hunger to be loved? To be significant to someone? How do you become a really good person? Did Jesus really live? What is the Bible, and what good is it for anyway? So we have all these good questions. That's just a minuscule. About God, about Jesus, about the Bible, about life, about all kinds of things. And the point is, as Christians, we need to pursue them, not fear them. Loving God includes not just with our heart and our soul and our strength, but with our mind. Do you have questions? Questions that you're afraid to maybe ask in church? Far too many Christians do. Sometimes it's because we believe that we should already know the answer, and we don't want to look dumb. Sometimes we're nervous that our question somehow isn't okay, that maybe there's something wrong or inappropriate with the question, or worse yet, with questions about God, Jesus, the faith, the Bible, life in general. Other times, more ominously, people don't want to ask their questions because they have the notion that to do that would somehow be unfaithful. Somewhere, sometime, the message that questions are a sign of doubt, and doubt is the opposite of faith. It's a message we receive. But of course, doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt, as Frederick Buechner wrote, is the ants in the pants of faith. My favorite theologian, Helmut Thielicke, said, in order to believe greatly, you have to doubt greatly. You have to ask questions in a great manner. They're necessary and essential to a robust and healthy faith, trust. We should ask our questions of Jesus at church. Ask them. Now, I don't mean shout them out in the middle of a sermon. You put me on the spot, but ask them. We have a lot of wise, deep, experienced, smart Christians in this congregation. And while you may not get a fully satisfying answer to every question you give voice to, I feel confident that you will get a thoughtful and probably provoking response that will lead you a little further down the path and a little further closer to Jesus. Questions are good. They're the mark of a curious, lively, healthy mind. And there are a lot of reasons to ask them. Here's a few of them. Simply to learn and to gain knowledge. You ask questions. To eliminate confusion, to clarify what is and isn't the truth is another reason to ask questions. To gain deeper insight into an event or a happening or a dynamic. To demonstrate humility to another person. To gain empathy through better understanding of another's view. One of the best ways to begin a relationship is by asking, we do it all the time, asking questions. What brought you to church this morning? Where did you grow up? There's all kinds of questions that we ask just to begin a relationship with someone we don't know. And then there's all kinds of questions that can be asked in order to strengthen that relationship. Do you understand why questions are so important to ask Jesus? Most of these things are relational. In our gospel story this morning, the disciples fail to understand the future that Jesus is describing for the Son of Man, for himself as the Son of Man. A future of suffering, of dying and rising again. And it's not the first time they don't get it. It won't be the last. It will happen actually 3 times in the course of 3 chapters. But by not asking questions, the disciples are failing to comprehend more than just Jesus' future. Their silence indicates that they don't recognize Jesus' graciousness, how gracious Jesus is. They fear his judgment. They forget that they are loved. That one thing important we sang of this morning. Even so, I have to be willing to forgive their confusion and reluctance to learn more about what Jesus is saying. After all, this is pretty mind-exploding stuff that Jesus is sharing with them. I mean, absolutely no one expected that the promised Messiah would redeem Israel through suffering and dying and rising from some grave. No one anticipated Jesus' cross, and his resurrection is even more incredible. I mean, it's unlooked for. It's downright astounding, shocking. So if they don't understand, even this second time that Jesus has been trying to teach them this, I get it. I can even sympathize with the things that make them and us hesitant to ask our questions. But what might have happened if they could imagine that there is nothing Jesus wants more than for them to share their questions, their struggles, their doubts, so that he might help them understand his teaching, and in this way be drawn closer not only to him but to the Father. Perhaps if they had asked questions, they would have understood more quickly and easily that greatness doesn't lie in power, but in compassion, and is not achieved by status, but by humble service. Notice, Jesus doesn't get mad with the disciples here. He doesn't judge them. He doesn't even reprimand them. Instead, what does he do? He embraces a child. One of the most curious, vulnerable, questioning creatures on earth. Jesus reminds his disciples that this is how they show humility in welcoming others and what makes them great. It's the way to welcome Jesus himself and the Father. So, what is the point this morning? The point is to take heart, all of you who are befuddled and confused by Jesus. Take heart. If you're confused, if you're uncertain about who he is and what he's up to in the world, so it was in the beginning, from the very start, even with his closest first disciples. So take heart. And if you aren't confused, if you aren't uncertain, you're not asking enough questions. Get it going. Jesus doesn't reject those who question. He doesn't reject those who have continued incomprehensiveness of who he is. He patiently continues to teach, to show, to lead, to guide. A number of years ago, one of our youth came up to me after a Sunday service, and he says to me, how come we have to come to church every Sunday and listen to the same stories again and again and again? I said, good question. Why do we keep going over the same material Sunday after Sunday about Jesus? And I responded, well, this is America. And being a Christian doesn't come naturally here. No one is born knowing any of these Jesus stories. All of us are dependent on someone to tell us the truth, to share with us the stories. And since there are so many counter stories out there in the world, on the web, on TV, that try to tell you who you are and who you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to be doing in the world, stories that are the opposite of the truth of Jesus, we have to keep hammering these stories into one another week after week, reiterating, repeating. This truth is so strange and so different, it requires weekly retelling and more. Does that help? I asked. Not much, he responded, not realizing that his reply simply reinforced the point. Here's the response and the point I want you to take this morning. I want to invite you to pass the little white pieces of paper, and if you need a pen, there's a couple there, I think, with each card. I want you to take that card, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to write down a question about faith or God or the Bible or faith and life that you wonder about. It might be a question that you've been afraid to ask in church. Go ahead and ask it. Nobody's going to ask you to write your name down on this card, okay? Might be a question that you've tossed and turned over in your mind for some time. It might be a question that only came to you recently because of something that happened to you, some event, some experience. Write down that question. Then fold the paper, and we'll have you place that in the offering plate when it comes around. Why? Your questions are an important part of your journey of faith, the growth, the deepening of your faith. And just as we give God our time, our talents, our money, so we gratefully give God our questions, our challenges, and our doubts. Take a moment or two to write those down. Yes, we have more paper.